Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Stiasny, and I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor International Learning and Teaching at the University of London. I'm delighted to say a word of welcome to you all at this, the 15th RIDE conference, organised by the Director and Fellows of the Centre for Distance Education here at the University of London. The format, which is of course virtual, is spread across 3 half days. Firstly, in order to meet the significant demand for presentations, which we both welcome and take as an endorsement of the growing reputation of RIDE. And then secondly, to make virtual participation as comfortable and enjoyable as possible. But we hope in 2022 to be able to offer blended modes, including a presence in Senate House. We'll see. The theme of this year's conference is Learning Through Disruption, and this refers to the reality of the last 15 months. Disruption on a scale that would have been hard to imagine. But on the much more positive side, the great deal of learning and innovation that we've all been able to undertake, which will take us forward to different approaches to learning and teaching in the future. The response to and learning from disruption has allowed us to offer a conference programme built around research and practice at the cutting edge in the field of distance and online education, reported on by keynote speakers from outside, as well as from within the wider University of London network. It is a matter of pride that so much innovation takes place in our Federation of Universities in London, and this forum allows us to learn and share. I want to offer a special warm welcome to our conference participants from outside the University of London network and our international visitors too. We're delighted to be able to welcome you all. Thanks in particular to those from our Centre for Distance Education who've organised the day. The Centre's Director, Dr. Linda Amrane-Cooper, Mark Beasley, the CDE Administrator, and the CDE Lead for Research and Dissemination, Professor Stylianos Hatzipaganos and Alan Tate. I'll turn now to Dr. Linda Amrane-Cooper, Director of Strategic Projects at the University of London and Head of the CDE, to share a little detail about the event. Linda, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mary. A warm welcome from the Centre for Distance Education to this exciting and diverse conference. As Mary mentioned, our overall theme this year is Learning Through Disruption. And we have divided the conference into 3 half days with a focus for each day. Quite rightly, with students at the heart of successful learning, we kick off today with a series of inputs that centre on student experience and student engagement. Tomorrow afternoon, we take a close look at redesigning assessment, with speakers exploring a wide range of significant innovation in this rapidly developing area. This will include grappling with some of the significant challenges posed by online assessment. And we close the week with an opportunity to consider the ways in which we are all rethinking learning and teaching, celebrating innovation and opportunities, and not forgetting to acknowledge the huge effort that colleagues across the globe have made to ensuring learning continues through disruption. Across our 3 themed days, we have a combination of keynote presentations supported by respondents, invited talks from industry leaders, and parallel sessions that allow for a wide range of inputs and discussions. We are expecting a large audience who we welcome, so we do hope to make the event as interactive as possible in this digital format. We invite you to use the chat function as well as the Q&A option to direct your more specific questions. Our discussion chairs will be encouraging you to share your ideas, comments and questions. If you are using Twitter, then please include the hashtag #RIDE, R-I-D-E 2021, so RIDE 2021 in your tweets. A warm thank you for joining the RIDE conference today and during our next 2 days. In the programme, you have all the session links and should be able to just click and join. Before we move on to our first keynote, I have the real pleasure now to invite Mary to announce the 2021 Roger Mills Prize for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. Mary.
Thank you, Linda. I'm delighted to introduce the outcomes of the Roger Mills Award for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, an award made by the University of London in the name of a founding member of the Centre for Distance Education, Dr. Roger Mills, respected and loved by his colleagues in equal measure. The panel this year consisted of Dr. Linda Amrane-Cooper, Head of CDE, Dr. David Baum, and Professor Alan Tate, CDE Fellows, and also me. We were pleased to consider 4 applications for the award, 4 very strong nominations, as the panel asked me to emphasise. And we had the very difficult job of selecting just one winning project against the criteria of innovation and value, impact and transferability. So let me begin by reporting on the projects. Firstly, we were very impressed by the project reported on by Dr. Paul Dudley of Royal Holloway, University of London, on how he and colleagues set about the reimagining of the BSc in Business Administration using a valuable model for programme enhancement in very effective ways. We would like to commend this project for its very purposeful commitment to quality enhancement and innovation. Secondly, we would also like to commend the project from Queen Mary University London, led by Dr. Faith Nightingale, on the development of an innovative games-based approach to the support of communication and teamworking skills for an engineering course delivered in China. This was in the form of escape rooms, which students had to learn to work together to escape from. Thirdly, and again warmly commended, was a project from University College London, led by Professor Sam Schmidt, Joe Stroud, Dr. Martin Compton, well titled Innovation in Action. The project seeks to analyse what has been learned from the solutions developed to learning and teaching in the pandemic emergency, which closed the campus. This is with the intention of building effective blended learning and teaching for the future. This is hugely important, not only for UCL, but also for so many universities and colleges. And we believe that UCL will be able to report on the outcomes of this project this time next year. And lastly, although it was difficult to select just one winner, in the end, we were clear that one project stood out. And this was the development of the Digital Skills Awareness course, led by Sarah Sherman and Nancy Weitz from the Bloomsbury Learning Exchange. The promotion and support of digital skills for academics and university professionals, as well as students, is central at this pivotal point in the move to blended technology supported learning. What was remarkable about this project were the ways in which transferability and impact were built into its very identity through its construction on the principles of open education resources. The success of this approach and its value to the sector as a whole is validated by the issuing already of 49 open education resource licenses from the Bloomsbury Learning Exchange to other institutions to use and adapt the digital skills awareness courses for their own purposes. So our congratulations to Sarah, Nancy, and the Bloomsbury Learning Exchange in winning the Roger Mills Award for Innovation in 2021. And congratulations too to the 3 other excellence projects submitted from Royal Holloway, UCL, and Queen Mary, all commended for excellence. We are delighted that our prize winners will all be able to showcase their work later in the week on Friday morning as part of our keynote opening slot. Now we turn to the conference program itself, and I hope very much that you will enjoy today and the rest of the week. I will now invite Linda to introduce our first keynote session. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Mary. And my congratulations to Sarah and Nancy. Fantastic job, but also I'd like to comment on the real strength of all of the applications for the Roger Mills Prize. Very exciting. Colleagues, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our keynote speaker this morning on the first day of our conference. With a focus on student experience and student engagement, I don't think we could start the conference inputs in a more appropriate way. We are joined this morning by Dr. Helen Helsper, to provide our keynote, and Dr. Virna Rossi to act as a respondent. Dr. Ellen Helsper is Professor of Socio-Digital Inequalities in the Media and Communications Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, a member of the University of London Federation. Her interests include digital literacy, the links between social and digital inequalities, vulnerability and discrimination in digital spaces, mediated communication and interpersonal relationships, and methodological innovation in quantitative and qualitative media and communications research. I don't think we could have picked a better set of research interests for what has been a very disrupted but very interesting learning experience over the last few years, or last few months for our students. Dr. Virna Rossi is a passionate teacher with 22 years teaching experience in 10 different institutions of all types and sizes in an education settings, primary, secondary, college, adult and higher education. She's been in teacher education for 12 years and finds it very rewarding to assist colleagues develop their practices. Virna is particularly interested in inclusivity, inclusive learning design, inclusive assessment as learning, and inclusive feedback for learning. She's currently co-creating a book on inclusive learning design with over 70 contributions from all the continents. So I think we have an excellent opening session with Ellen as our keynote and Virna as our respondent. I'll hand over to Ellen now to deliver her keynote entitled Digital Disconnect, Educational Inequalities in a Digital Age. Ellen.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Linda. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today and to share some of the experiences and kind of ideas with you from the projects that I've been working on over the last few decades, really, already. I will share my screen because obviously we have some digital material to illustrate. I'm going to make. Let's hope it works. Okay. So what I will be talking about today is the work that I've been doing with colleagues from around the world around digital inequalities and how they're related to social or kind of historical inequalities, both between regions and between different countries. And in this kind of pandemic age, in which everyday life, everything in everyday life has rapidly digitized, it's put in stark kind of reality, the harsh consequences of being excluded or not being able to participate fully in the digital age. And I will kind of talk more in general about this, but also specifically how this has played out and what the causes and consequences are of these inequalities, especially in relation to learning, both formal and informal learning. I will be showing some data which are from the two main projects that I'm working on right now. They're umbrella projects, the Youth Skills Project, which is a European project looking at youth skills and well-being in digital societies, and the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which is a project that is a global project which looks at this across generations and tries to develop both measures and tools to look at digital skills, but also to look at kind of the broader spectrum of issues that have to do with inequalities in a digital age. So I thought I'd start the presentation with kind of a definition of digital literacy. And I'm very delighted to hear about the prize that was just awarded, because it very much connects with a lot of the work that we're doing. Obviously, to participate in a digital society, one of the key things, one of the key resources that people and young people, students, but also teachers and parents and other people's involved in the education of young people, the thing that they would have to rely on is a kind of a literacy to be able to navigate this digital world. And it's important to understand the kind of the underlying definition of digital literacy that underpins my work and that of many others. And it always starts with this kind of idea of the opportunity and the ability to use ICTs or information and communication technologies. But importantly, in our work is that we say it's not just about using them, but also in being able to make the decision when it's better not to use them or not to use certain features. And this is all placed into the context of doing this in ways that allows individuals to obtain beneficial outcomes. So it's not so much about the skills themselves or the access itself, but it's what they provide you in terms of the outcomes that you are able to obtain through the use of technologies or engagement with these digital technologies. And this goes across all domains of everyday life. And in this presentation, I'll be focusing particularly on education and learning. But it's also just like it's the ability to decide or when to use them, or the autonomy to decide when to use them, as opposed to deciding when or not to use them. That it's also about avoiding negative outcomes for themselves. The digital world has come to represent both the good and the bad of society. It's a reflection in many ways of the wider world out there, which has positive and negative aspects, of course. And then important, especially when we talk about digital literacy and engagement, to make this kind of literacy sustainable for the future, it is not just about being able to use the platforms and the software that are available right now, but also any kind of digital world we might live in the future. And I will finish the presentation in talking a little bit about how this digital future might look slightly different from the one that we are in now and what that means. Now, as I already indicated, my work really is focused on inequality, and inequalities in this literacy, this broad definition of literacy, of the ability and the opportunity to participate in the digital world. And important here is that this concept of inequality refers to systematic differences between groups or regions of the world or regions within countries, not differences between individuals, but on differences that put certain groups systematically at a disadvantage. And I'll show in my presentation how there's a lot of evidence for kind of causes at this systemic level, and that therefore also the solutions to inequalities and participation need to be at that level, at that structural level. I'll present here the general framework that this kind of a concept of digital literacy is embedded in, but with a specific focus on the kind of educational resources. Of course, technologies do not come out of nowhere. They are designed within a world that already existed, a non-digital world, and in which resources, people's socioeconomic resources and personal resources have been unequally distributed between different groups and regions of the world. We have this kind of first level of inequalities in the digital resource space, which has to do with access, the quality of access, the autonomy that we have to use technologies when we need them for the purposes that we want to use them for. Then we include there also kind of attitudes and motivations. That's the kind of drive to get online. Then what we look at the second level is more what traditionally has been called digital literacy, which is a combination between kind of confidence or self-efficacy and the skills and knowledge about to use and to understand the digital world. It's very important here to emphasize we really need to make a distinction between the kind of more functional skills to use technologies in the way they were designed by others, and the kind of skills that are more about a critical awareness around how the digital world works, why things are presented to you, content, services, interactions in a certain way that they weren't presented to you before in a non-digital world. So it's really important, and I will come back to this throughout the presentation. And then the other thing that kind of is important when we talk about digital inequalities or digital engagement is this kind of aspect of what we actually do online. And in the book that I've just published, which is called The Digital Disconnect, the Social Causes and Consequences of Digital Inequalities, I focus in the fourth chapter on these two areas of formal education, which we can think of as things like both homework as being able to use the technologies to kind of do homework, but also to take courses outside of the kind of the education system that students might be attending. And informal learning, which is what we do, most of us do in everyday life, and is distributed. All these resources, these digital resources, kind of are important because they can lead to certain educational outcomes that might feed back into these resources that we already have. And we can think of formal educational outcomes, such as getting a degree or a certificate of a high quality, getting employment because we've gotten certain kind of, we've learned certain skills, or we've engaged with certain content online, being able to participate better on the workforce. There's also these aspects of educational outcomes that have to do more with self-actualization and empowerment to not only kind of use or be in society in a more passive sense, but also to participate actively and create content. So historically, all these digital resources have been distributed unequally. And what is important here is to kind of emphasize that it's in a model that I use a lot in my work, which is about the corresponding fields of inequality, is that we often, once we acquire access and skills, use the technologies to augment or increase the resources that we already have historically in the groups that we come from. So people who have really extensive social network, really close social contacts, but come from areas where or families where formal education has not been accessible or is not kind of really appreciated to a certain extent. When they get access to technologies and they acquire skills, they will use these often to kind of empower themselves socially and create networks of connections, but not necessarily to go and do a formal course, which is what is often hoped for in a more optimistic vision of what giving access and literacy will do for people who've been historically disadvantaged, and young people, and as well as their parents. And so I will start now by presenting some data. I will go through this relatively quickly. Read the book if you want more information, or contact me. But I'm also aware we have some time for Q&A at the end. And if there's any questions, I'm obviously willing to answer them. In the book, I use both qualitative and quantitative data from around the world. One of the things that the kind of qualitative fed into is these vignettes that I use, and Anna is the vignette that I use in the chapter for around educational inequalities. And one of the things that we notice here is that this kind of digital inequalities and their links to social or traditional historical inequalities is a very sequential process. It's often the people who've had accumulation of a lack of resources that have lower quality access, that have less autonomy over using the technologies that even the ones that they have access to at home. They often have kind of more negative attitudes towards what technology can do for you in terms of for you in particular, or the group you belong to. On top of that, they often have less or lower levels of the kind of technical skills that you need, or the kind of critical information navigation skills that you need to be able to use technologies and learn from technologies. So it is a kind of a sequential process. And then often the content that's available online is not geared or doesn't represent the experiences of people who come from disadvantaged groups. So you will hear people like Anna say, oh, well, technology, that's a geeky men's thing. I'm really clumsy with them, connotation because I'm a woman. So she asks her boyfriend, she asks her son, because they are obviously really on board. And she just does the basic thing as in a more passive use of technology. Now, what is interesting also about this is that if we look at a global level, we see that things like actually more informal skills in the way that they are distributed amongst the population at large, amongst different groups, but also regionally in the world, that kind of informal problem-solving skills, rather than formal educational qualifications, although they are also very important, are a very good predictor at whether we are able to use technologies in a general sense, in terms of the skills that we have at home. And that in countries or in groups where traditionally there have been higher levels of problem-solving skills, and this is PIAC data and certainly reflected through PISA data, is that those countries and those groups that have had higher levels of problem-solving skills are often able to use the technologies in ways that really kind of improve their experiences of it. So, and in countries or regions or that have had these educational resources, we can also see that technologies are used more for education, in particular by the advantaged group. Sorry. We need to make a distinction in this, and this is actually really important, especially for education, between confidence and skills, because we see that while they are often related, they are in the digital space, as we know from some other areas as well of education, not necessarily related. So it is important to make that distinction, because confidence is a driver of use, of playful learning with technology, of thinking that, you know, when something goes wrong, it's probably because the technology was badly designed, not because I am kind of slightly less competent in using them. They are also a driver not just of passive use of technology, but of active production of content. And this confidence is very strongly related to people's status in society. It's the groups that have been privileged, that have these kind of levels of confidence in a more general sense of their role in society, that have higher levels of confidence. Personal resources, such as kind of, you know, kind of more individual economic resources or interest or things like that, are often the drivers of the time that's spent online. Now, what we see here, and this is a complicated graph, but I'll distill it, is that the confidence at the beginning, when a young person enters an educational system, for example, that the confidence at the beginning determines a lot to the extent to which they will use technologies, more so even than skills, and that it's not through learning by doing, it's not just through being online that we will gain confidence. In fact, it's the other way around. People who have a lot of confidence will use the technology more, and then subsequently. There's also a 2-year time lag, which is an interesting, or a difference, is that actually the prediction of confidence at the beginning is a really strong predictor of confidence in year 2 or 3, independent of how much we've used technology. But this is a different confidence from skills, which is the actual ability to use, or the knowledge that we have about how technologies function. And skills make the difference between kind of literature use with positive outcomes, learning outcomes and other outcomes, and intense use with negative outcomes. And that's what I will be talking about next. Now, what we see here is data from the Youth Skills Project. And we can see that often, you know, adults and young people overestimate how digitally native a lot of young people actually are. And so these are young adults and young people, teenagers. And we can see that of a kind of a series of truth claims, kind of a test that we did with them, that only about just about half of the young people got half of the tasks right, which means that half of these knowledge items right, which means that half of them did not. Now, why is this really important? Because the knowledge items that we created were often to do with the critical understanding of how technologies function, how they maybe manipulate us to perform certain behaviors, or how they are discriminatory in certain ways. And we see that these kind of critical knowledge skills are much more unequally distributed and have a much more impact on a broad range of learning outcomes, both formal and informal learning. And so while kind of more technical functional skills on how to use technologies or to navigate information were less unequally distributed, but also had more narrow kind of benefits for outcomes. And so this is really important when we think about designing literacy and skills program, that we do not forget, yes, programming is important. Yes, the technical skills kind of are important, but we also need to think about other skills. This is what I want to show here, which is that we need to distinguish different types of skills. I'm showing here some information on kind of basic content creation skills and the distribution of these amongst populations, and programming skills. And we can see that the two are very clearly related, and that, in fact, if we delve deeper, that it's often because of, you know, in societies where there's a kind of a good solid base of basic content creation skills. And when I talk about basic content creation skills, these are very basic, such as transferring files between a computer, sending something in attachment by email, using copy and paste tools or something like that. You know, in our research in the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, we talk about very basic things like making a photo and kind of taking a picture and uploading that on a profile. And there's still quite a few people, young people, as I'll show you in a minute, who struggle with that. But what we see is that this basis of basic content creation skills is really important for also the creation of these kind of more advanced programming skills. And interesting, and it's a point I'll come back to again and again, is that these basic content creation skills, like these kind of problem-solving skills that we saw in the beginning, are often not learned through formal education. They're learned through informal education and learning. And so we can see that historically the countries and the groups that have had kind of general educational resources, or who have had countries that have had more equal educational systems, less stratified educational systems, also have higher levels of general skills within the population, but more importantly, that they are more equally distributed. What we see is that the traditionally privileged have more self-confidence and feel more respected in and belong to the society in which they live, which also in relation to content creation skills, make them more likely to produce content online. They get validated because they produce content in a way that is acceptable, that's seen as, you know, the norm by wider society, which means, and this is important for where I will end the presentation, that they also, by producing so much of this type of content, unknowingly or unwittingly silence others who might not be of that mainstream. Beyond this importance of content creation skills, because that is what creates the world. If you create content, even simple content, that creates this digital space for others who come after you, we see that other skills are also very important in relation to full participation in the digital world, in education in particular. And so we talked about knowledge. This is and about skills, and these are performance tests that we are designing within the Youth Skills Project that will also be available to educators to test young people's skills through some fun tasks in terms of these kind of different dimensions of skills, right? So we have a kind of information navigation skills, which is kind of, you know, how to use technologies, information processing skills, communication, how to protect your own data, but also to have positive interactions with others, which is kind of more this netiquette. What we can see is that the emphasis in many schools in Europe has been on kind of information processing and especially evaluating whether something is true or false or like misinformation. But we can see that young people in general tend to do better on these in terms of the tasks that we have. Yeah, and so this is actual skill. This is not a self-estimation of their abilities. What we see, however, is that especially when it comes to communication and interaction, we see that young people really struggle. And this is really important when we talk about education in the pandemic age, which has been obviously on a lot of these digital platforms. What we see here is that especially young people from disadvantaged background have struggled to know how to present themselves, don't have the confidence or the feeling that their voices are heard. Often the technologies are designed in such a way that if you are silent or you don't turn your camera on, you are actually invisible because you will not be on camera. There will not be the one that's highlighted in a circle. They are also, a lot of young people struggle in that sense to know what to do with kind of a negative behavior online. So in the study that we did with the Prince's Trust, around 40% of all young people struggled with decisions on their own behavior or dealing with the negative behavior of others online. So this was like people who really didn't know what to do. And these are often not the kinds of skills that we think of as digital skills that are kind of to be taught in formal settings, but they are very important for educational settings, because young people who struggle with this, and again, this is unequally distributed, are often silenced, or they disconnect, or they are not able to participate in what is fundamentally a communicative and social space of learning. This is a little bit the field in which girls are stronger in kind of understanding this. We also see that there's more critical awareness amongst disadvantaged groups because they have been exposed also to more discriminatory messages and interactions in the wider society. And then those who are more likely to be discriminated offline are also more likely to be discriminated online, and are less likely to be heard by the silent majority when they are kind of participating in this digital space. So where I'm going to with this is that there needs to be kind of a broader awareness and consciousness of, and so this is not about teaching disadvantaged young people necessarily these critical skills of understanding and these kind of skills of netiquette and how, you know, kind of to respect and to produce information and content that's beyond the kind of mainstream norm. This is a responsibility of all of us, because it's often the advantaged or the privileged young people and adults who are complicit in creating this world that is less welcoming, so in digital spaces. So this is something where a lot of work is needed. I will finish by talking a little bit about the outcomes and in learning, and this is very important in the pandemic. We've recently done a study also in the Netherlands during the pandemic, where some of the earlier findings were confirmed. What we see is that, let me just go through all of these to speed up the process a little bit. What we see is that when we look at formal learning outcomes, we see that they are distributed in unequally ways that could be expected, with those people who have had privileged backgrounds getting more positive, high quality formal learning outcomes, while for informal learning, we see something else happening where actually the distribution is not necessarily as might be expected. For negative outcomes, which have to do, you know, with also mostly with informal learning outcomes, for example, you know, trying to kind of encountering misinformation or starting but not finishing, you know, kind of something that you were learning online or not learning much, we see that actually some of the groups that have more, traditionally more resources, often are more dissatisfied or have more negative experiences than young people who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. This has to be put into context, into that sequential idea of kind of inequalities, where it is true, however, that young people who come from economically, educationally disadvantaged backgrounds have lower quality access and often have some more negative or fewer of these kind of functional skills, which means that they are disadvantaged. But in terms of the outcomes, once they are online, they are actually learning more and happier about their learning in a more informal setting. So to do this, yeah. So we see that kind of sometimes these findings are unexpected. We'll finish this presentation by talking about the kind of unequal or the kind of solutions to this problem, which what we've traditionally seen is that you know, they kind of focus on the inequalities between people from different social cultural groups or individuals who don't have kind of resources or skills, and we do training, or we try to systemically change kind of distribution of resources. Then another thing that is very common is that we look at kind of, you know, city or neighborhood levels, and national policies get implemented in the city or the neighborhood, or we think about the school there, or workplaces where you have curricula, certifications. In the home environment, there's been quite a lot of work on parenting and how you might help parents who lack resources. What we see in terms of effectiveness is that this individualistic approach is not very useful. Instead, what we see is, because of this importance of informal learning of these skills, the unequal distribution of environments, social and digital environments in the home, at schools, in kind of where a lot of young people attend who are disadvantaged, the kind of cities or neighborhoods where they live, yeah, these ecologies are putting these young people at a disadvantage. That, for example, kind of it's more about the overall digital environment and not just the formal training that will help these young people from all backgrounds to be able to participate, so that we need to go beyond courses and classes are formal, because they are actually often focused on these kind of functional skills, not on these strategic or critical skills that allow everybody to co-create the digital as well as the social environment. it's hard to do through formal education alone, especially because formal education is taken up more by advantaged and disadvantaged, or advantaged students than disadvantaged students. They have better outcomes. But informal learning is a very strong shaper of digital learning, and much more can be done, because as we've seen, young people from more disadvantaged background are very open to this more informal form of learning. So while they struggle to translate use into high quality formal education outcomes and are more likely to have negative experiences with formal online education, they do not necessarily have that same experience with informal learning. Sometimes it might be because the content is not representative of their life worlds, their life worlds, their ecologies in which they live, not stimulate this kind of learning. They do not see examples of how to use technologies in a broader sense. But more importantly, since we're moving towards a future in which technologies are embedded, become invisible when we talk about algorithms, AI, virtual reality environments, augmented reality environments, the Internet of Things, where it's not, these functional skills will become less important, and it will become more about these critical skills of an understanding what the technology is doing because of the way we are interacting with it or engaging with it. It's important that we do education around technology that is adaptable, that's not focused on the technology, but on the outcomes that we want to achieve. And we to teach how we can remain autonomous and take advantage of the opportunities without suffering further disadvantage or the people who are around us, and without causing the exclusion of others. And this is where I would like to finish, because this digital future really starts in a school or a home or a workplace or a network near us. It's not the responsibility of the disadvantaged to catch up and to get individual skills and come there. But we need to understand that how we all use ICTs in our everyday lives impacts not only our own lives, but also of the future generations who come after us and others who live and observe us, who are exposed to the way the content we create and the actions that we take on and offline in these digital societies. So we are collectively tasked with creating a positive digital future, not just for ourselves and an individual being, kind of well-being, but also for that of others. And therefore, collective teaching with communities, creating awareness and not just teaching skill, is fundamental to creating a digital future in which everybody can participate. Okay, I think I might have gone a little bit over time, but I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for listening to what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
Sharing, no? Yeah, I'll stop sharing so that.
That's great. Virna, welcome. And Virna, you're going to provide an initial response, and we've got some questions coming in and comments. So audience, please do keep inputting your questions and comments, and Virna and I will hopefully help to manage that after Virna's given her response. Thanks, Virna, and thanks, Ellen. Fantastic. I wish we could clap. I do, you know, I am clapping, but it's one of the things that I really miss from these virtual things is a real expression of sound. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Hello, everybody. Hello, Ellen. Thank you so much for this wonderful keynote. Really, really, so much. It's just the amount of interesting points. I don't even know where to start from, but I'd just like to say something, talking about digital advantage, disadvantage. We have recently moved back from Italy to London, and I thought, wow, in London we will have amazing connectivity. So in fact, the last 2 days have been absolutely atrocious. So because of this, I think I would probably like to switch my camera off. I hope you don't mind, because I think you will hear me better. So I'll just do that. Sorry about that. So it's just been a bit unstable the last 2 days. So I'd like to say, first of all, that I really appreciate this. I mean, the book that you've written and the ideas that you've shared. I have not been able to read the entire book, but I've read a fair amount, and I've been struck by a number of things. Number one, the fact that you provide such an interesting historical perspective. I think that's so important, because you talk about let's call it traditional disadvantage, and what does that mean, and where does that come from, and then how that sort of connects and translates into a modern day digital disadvantage. I think that's very important to bear in mind, because you talk about this cumulative generational effect, and how the students that we meet today they have a historical background, a cultural and family background, which already sets them either at an advantage or disadvantage, we could say, digitally. So I think that's very important. The other thing that I really like is the fact that the way you explain what inequalities are and disadvantage, what that means. And sort of the other way is the criterion for inclusion. You say that it's how people, how they themselves estimate what it means to be included. I think that's so important. Again, the fact that it's how each person feels and experiences either inclusion or disadvantage. And so we need to know this. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute. It's you know, how students actually perceive it themselves. I'm talking about students, of course, because in this educational context, but people in general, yeah. So then this, one of the slides that you talked about, the digital divides or disadvantage in those three key areas, which is access, skills and user literacy, and outcomes. And again, I thought that that inclusion of outcomes in that context is very important. So again, thinking about education and our students, we are in an outcome-based system. So we expect outcomes from students and outputs. So it's a very interesting question. You know, are we expecting what is fair, let's say, in terms of outcomes? So I know that you were talking about more broadly about outcomes, but we need to apply that as practitioners to what we expect, for example, in terms of assessment, let's say. So again, I'm going to come back to this in a minute. And then the last thing is, I also like the fact that in your book, you combine very well, you integrate both qualitative and quantitative data so that we see both the personal and the systemic. I think that's really important to join those two. And the vignettes which demonstrate what life is like for people with very different circumstances around the world to our own. And I would just like to say something that happened to me last week. I was leading a workshop about inclusive learning design. And then one of the participants was a teacher from Pakistan. And in their university, they have, I don't know if it's an outreach or another campus, they provide courses, a variety of courses, but particularly to do with nursing in a war-torn area of the country. And so this teacher was telling us that, talking about intersectionality of disadvantage. So you've got a large amount of female students already in a particular area where higher education for women is not easy to attain. Then you've got an ongoing civil conflict. Then you've got the fact that, of course, there's a pandemic right now, which doesn't help, but also they do not have Wi-Fi. The government has restricted Wi-Fi. So the only way for these students to connect and study is they have to actually go into the military compounds to get access. So I was thinking about some of the things that you write about and how we think about ICT. What does it mean? And these three levels that you were talking about, access, literacy, and outcomes. So these young ladies who are studying this course, because the teacher told us they were all ladies in this case, you know, how are they experiencing it? What support do they have? And, you know, this disadvantage at different levels, how does it affect them? So just something to think about, that sometimes we have students join. Do we realize, are we empathetic to their different backgrounds, where they come from and what their experiences have been so far? And how all these different levels, you know, access, skills and use and outcomes, what have they done so far, and what, you know, what autonomy do they have in terms of digital profile, let's say, and background that they have. So I was thinking then, putting sort of lots of your ideas and my own interest in one thing together. When we talk about ourselves as teachers, as practitioners, and we design learning experiences for our students. So before we design those learning experiences, do we take the time to understand the digital profiles of our students, and how can we do that? So how can we understand the needs and abilities, capabilities of our students from a digital perspective, even before they turn up? so that we can design our learning accordingly, more inclusively. And once they actually turn up, because let's say we are gauging that before we meet the students, so how can we do that? Again, through perhaps both qualitative and quantitative data that we might be able to gather. And then in terms of when they actually turn up and they are there as our students, we have the real people in front of us, not just the anticipated ones. So how can we then check really what their digital profiles are, so that we can adjust our design, our learning design, so that we can actually support them in developing further digitally, for example. So I was thinking that is like just generally a suggestion that we really need to have these conversations with our students, as well as with our colleagues, as well as with management. We need to engage people in conversations, talking about the type of things that you discussed in your keynote, really understanding these digital divides or disadvantages. How do they affect our students? What can we do? Because we all have a certain sphere of influence. And so I think if we actually talk about this, just like we try to understand our students, perhaps if they have, special, particular educational needs, such as neurodiversity, but what about their digital needs? So I think it needs to be part of that conversation, and that will really help us do, what you said about trying to reduce these inequalities and disadvantages that we have. So I don't know if the response is a bit random, but I just wanted to share those ideas. So I don't know actually whether in your book you discuss learning design and the possibility of creating digital profiles. Perhaps I missed it, or but I'm not sure what you think about it. But I know that we also have other questions and answers, but I don't know whether you would like to say something there.
Thank you. What would you like me to do, Linda? Just said,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, absolutely.
I've tried to keep an eye also a little bit on the comments, and I think some of these kind of go to the comments that, or speak to the comments that Virna already made. So I think, yeah, there's always a big question. It's easy to identify problems and issues, but solutions are often as complex as the things that cause these complicated interactions between disadvantage or inequality in the traditional sense and the digital sense. So I think actually, to start with your questions about how can we do this kind of digital profiling, or kind of, understand the young person's social digital ecologies before they actually come to the school. I think there now, there is quite a bit of research, and, like at the risk of self-promotion, I do discuss this a little bit in the book. I might not have done this that much in the book in terms of like, okay, what does that mean for the education setting in particular, for the formal education setting in particular, but I've done that on other occasions. So one of the things that we do know, and that's where research is very useful, is in terms of access, for example. And I saw that there was a comment about Sri Lanka as well, where there's, definitely very large infrastructural problems and access problems. Is that there is quite, because there are such strong links between historical inequalities and digital inequalities that are work in that corresponding way, we can make fairly kind of, with caution, good assumptions about which types of students will be most at risk of not being able to participate in digital learning and education. What we need to, in terms of the correspondence there, is that we see often access is a problem of isolation, or a geographical isolation, because infrastructure is difficult to build if it comes to infrastructure. Then, access in itself, like just having, what I make a distinction in the book between potential access and actual access. So when we talk about potential access, that is having access to a device that you can use for the purposes that you need to use it. This kind of idea of autonomy is very strongly related to the economic resources of a family or a household, or the school in which young people are there. So their interventions like subsidies or plans to roll out technology to these kinds of areas or groups of individuals are extremely important. And I think we shouldn't forget that, right? Infrastructure and access interventions are important. They are the basis. Without access, or without you know, this kind of potential access to technologies, we are not going to be able to engage with them in any way, positive or negative. However, when we talk about actual access, which is not just the availability of devices, but also the use of the devices, we see other things that start playing a role. And this has to do with the autonomy over material goods. And this depends on the society in which we live. So we see that often in societies where economic and educational resources are dominated by men, for example, is that even if there is a device available in the household, the women in the household are often the last to get access to it for the things that they need to. So this includes girls. It's often, if we, you know, in the research that we do globally with also Global Kids Online, we see that the first person in the household often who has access to it, sometimes it's the father if there's a mobile phone that they use for work. And then if there's a son, the son is the next one. If they have a more kind of a device that allows you better engagement with things like homework, it's often the son who gets first access. Then it's the daughter, maybe if they're going to school, and then the mother is the last, right? And we all know from this that the mother's education is extremely important for future equality in terms of gender in a variety of domains. So this is kind of a replication of that pattern. So this is what I'm saying about kind of learning from the research that we know about traditional inequalities, historic inequalities. They can really help us. And this is the same, although the context is different within a country or like the UK, within the UK, where we can see that, you know, unequal distribution of economic resources is very strongly linked to inequalities in access to technology, to high quality tech. Then the things with skills, there we see kind of for these technical skills, these kind of skills of interpreting of information, we can see that young people who come from households with more lesser kind of, you know, fewer educational resources, like their parents might not have been that educated. You know, still a good predictor of whether somebody is literate in general or digitally literate is the number of books they actually have in the household. In the digital sense, it's the number of devices they have in the household, like different devices and the kinds of reading that's being done. But these are distributed in ways that are quite similar. And I think there was a question about multilinguistic background also in the chat, where, and this is important because, you know, if we have to, even though the internet gives access to a multiple range of resources in many, many different languages, the dominant language and most of the content, especially the ones that's kind of relevant for the context that we are living in right now, are in English, produced by very few regions of the world. Even the content that's produced about the global south or about regions that are not English are often produced by English speakers. So if you have a kind of a background where you are not as comfortable with English at home, it's not spoken as much, you will also struggle to engage with content online that is used in formal education spaces, obviously in the context in which we live. But this is a kind of a general trend. So we can use that kind of data to sketch a general profile. And of course, these are generalizations and individual students might be different. And that's where we come to when they show up. What shall we do? How can we do that? So there's currently quite a lot of, there's a few tools that's been developed. We can that allow us to test these kind of more functional or technical skills in a fun way, right? However, as I showed in my presentation, what is ignored, and I would say that's a call for action. I would say there's two calls for actions in this regard, also as regards to solutions or how to do this in a formal education setting. One is that these critical and social interaction skills, which learning is social by its very nature, because we have teachers, it's not just engaging with content, but it's engaging with the producers or the sharers of knowledge and content. That social aspect, this kind of more collective aspect of learning, is often ignored. And because the digital space has very particular kind of affordances on how you highlight certain types of knowledge, how certain types of knowledge is available, how certain people are heard when they contribute with their their knowledge and skills. And again, they're multilinguistic or less cultural kind of sensitivity to differences in communication can be very important in the digital space in particular, because the affordances are that you don't have as good a kind of visual contact to see if somebody's not there or not able to participate. So these kinds of, that's kind of the first point, is that there needs to be much more emphasis when young people come in to really talk about, have these discussions about, what are their experiences, which kind of social platforms, how are they learning informally, what are their kind of, what are they doing with technology at home, how, these kinds of informal discussions. And important is that this cannot be done individually, because these are collective awareness and collective skills, that developing this kind of netiquette, this understanding of how to behave and how to navigate, how to understand the digital world, is shared knowledge. And that therefore needs to be done in also kind of collective learning, in group projects and discussions. In terms of the curriculum, this means that you cannot just have an IT or computer course, but that the tech or the digital aspect needs to be embedded across the curriculum as we learn about different subjects. So in history, history is told by, let's call it, the winners, and there's a critical understanding of how history is created, and we can use that kind of context to explain how digital information and what is available and how are different people represented. And this is just one example. And this is something that people who teach history or geography or any of the other courses that might not be explicitly digital, they have a lot of these kinds of skills embedded in them. And so this is a discussion as a staff that we can have.
Ellen, I think I probably, sadly, need to...
we've run out of time. That's what I was just going to say.
Yeah, we have run out of time. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much for picking up on the questions, actually. I think you've covered a great deal in your response there. And also Virna picked up a lot of that in her input. So that's fabulous. We will have a blog from the conference, and Claire, one of the CDE fellows, helps to write those blogs or coordinates those blogs. And we'll try and make sure we pick up on questions and discussion as well. And of course, the video of the session will be available on the University of London YouTube channel in due course. So we'll make sure that everybody has those links who've attended. So thank you very much. Ellen and Virna, that was an absolutely stunning start to our conference. We've gone right up face to face with the challenges, particularly in spotlight in the pandemic, in that we're having to teach and learn in this online environment. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much to both of you. We have a break now, folks, until 10:30 when we have our parallel sessions, and in fact Virna is delivering one of our parallel sessions, which is fantastic. The details are in the program, and I've just put a little summary in the panel, and then we have our invited speaker from JISC at the end of today's session, and then the conference starts again tomorrow. So thank you very much. I'm sure that the audience are all doing a virtual clap. I'd like to do a virtual or real clap. Thank you. Thanks, audience, and we'll see you at 10:30 at the parallel sessions.